Cora Bias Cut Maxi Skirt sewing tutorial. That was a mouthful. Firstly, I apologize if there is background noise. I have my fan on because it is so hot in my studio, so I'm sorry if there's noise. Anyway, today we're making the Cora Maxi Skirt, or Cora Bias Cut Maxi Skirt, which is a really easy piece to make, and I thought it would be a really great beginner-friendly sewing pattern to release, since I just released my beginner's sewing guide video the other week, and I thought this would be a really good place for you to start if you've come from that video, you're confident with sewing and you want to make your first garment. When I make the skirt for my small business, I usually use an overlocker to overlock all the edges, the elastic, the hem, all of that stuff. But for this video, because I wanted to make it as if you didn't have an overlocker and maybe you don't want to do the zigzag stitching, I did a French seam method, which is where we basically just fold the seams over onto each other, and everything is all hidden. It is super secure, and it makes it look really professional as well. So the technique that we go over in the tutorial is the French seam method, but if you don't want to do that and you do have an overlocker, or you want to use your zigzag stitch method, then you can do that instead of how we fold all the fabrics over, which I'll talk about in the tutorial. I made it in this gorgeous chocolate linen color to match my April top, as well as my other chocolatey colored pieces, and it's super gorgeous. I'd suggest to make it in a light to mid-weight linen. I think that that's what works best with this pattern, but you can also use it in other woven fabrics of your choice, but I'd suggest sticking to something that's like more that mid-weighted fabric. Now, if you've never worked with a bias before and you have no idea how this woven fabric is supposed to give you all of this stretch and fit around your body, we're basically cutting on the bias. So that gives us that stretch in our width measurements. So if we're looking at fabric, mine's a bit funny looking, but if we're looking at this is our selvage, and our grain goes parallel to the selvage, going straight across, and you won't have any or really any give in that way. And then same with the width, that's another grain, so you'll get two grains. You're basically going like this, I guess. So you have one going parallel to the selvage and then one going parallel to the width of your fabric, and again you won't really have much give in the width as well. So to be able to have that stretch in the fabric so that we can fit it around our body, we're going to work on the bias, which I'm going to do it this way, which is the diagonal between those two lines, and as you can see we get that stretch. Depending on how thick your fabric is and the weave of your fabric, so the weave is obviously where all of the thread pieces go in between each other, depending on how loose that is will depend on how much give you have like all around. So if you're working with something like a chiffon or gauze, it'll probably have a looser weave, so you'll get that stretch, like a little bit of stretch in either the width or the length. Whereas something like this that has a bit of a tighter weave with the threads, you won't really get any give at all. And that's why we work with the bias, because then you get this nice little stretch here. I'm going to go into the cutting portion so that you can see how to lay your fabric and lay your pattern down on your fabric before you cut it all out. But let's get started with the video. Okay, so here's my pattern. My printer is a bit dodgy, so ignore that this arrow isn't connected. But basically this is our grain line. So this arrow here is showing us which way our grain goes. This pattern is both the back and the front of the skirt.
Lay your fabric on a flat surface, and I'm going to fold mine over onto itself like I said before, but if you're using a fabric with a print or pattern on it, I'd suggest to cut your pieces out individually. We're going to find the selvage edge and make sure it's nice and straight, as well as the grain going parallel to the width. The arrow on our pattern is going to go parallel to the width grain, and this will allow us to have that stretch in the fabric. With the French seam method, we're going to need to add an extra 1.5 centimeters around the outer edge of our pattern when we cut it out, because we're going to be folding the fabric over onto itself. So this will just add that extra seam allowance that we need. If you're just using an overlocker or a zigzag stitch, you won't need to add the extra 1.5, but I do suggest adding at least an extra 0.5 centimeter just as a little safety. You only need to cut out 2 pattern pieces, and then we're going to head over to the sewing machine. Now, if you're doing the French seam method, you're going to have the wrong sides of the fabric facing each other. So if you're using a patterned or printed fabric, that'll be the side that is on the inside of your fabric or the inside of your garment, and the right side is on the outside of your garment. So for me, it doesn't really matter because both sides are the same. If you're overlocking or zigzag stitching your garment, then you just have the right sides of the fabric facing. We're going to pin down the sides of our fabric, and then we're going to go to the sewing machine and we're going to sew a straight stitch all along that edge. When you're sewing your straight stitch as well, you're going to be leaving about a 1 centimeter seam allowance while sewing. Once you've finished one side, don't forget to back tack at the top and the bottom, and then you're going to go over and sew the other side down. Then once you finish that, this is what it should look like. You should have about 1 centimeter for your seam allowance. For the French seam, we're going to basically cut this in half. So you're going to go back to having about a 1/2 centimeter seam allowance. And this is what it should look like if you're doing it that way. If you're doing it with the overlocking method, you don't need to cut this off. You just go over and overlock your raw edges. Make sure you don't cut too close to your seam that you've just sewn as well, because you don't want the threads to accidentally come loose. Just make sure that you're leaving that 1/2 centimeter of edging. Take this over to your ironing board now and flip the skirt inside out, and we're going to press the seam out so that it sits nice and flat. I like to call this the pinching method, where you basically pinch where the seam is and just pull it out so it sits nice and flat and flush against one another. And we're just going to iron that nice and flat all along the edge there on both sides of the skirt. This is going to basically create a little casing for all of those raw edges on that seam that we've just sewn. So after we've finished ironing, this is what it should look like. And as you can see, the raw edge is on the inside there. And we want to make sure we can go to our sewing machine and sew a 1 centimeter seam allowance straight stitch all the way down the edge there. And this will create a little casing, those side seams, those place so that they don't slip around for one side, and then flip it over and do it for the other side. If you're overlocking or zigzag stitching your seams instead, you won't need to flip this over. You'll just have to sew your straight stitch seam with the right sides facing each other, and then sew your overlocking or zigzag stitch next to that to keep all of those raw edges all neat and tidy. And then you can move on to this part, which is the hemming and the casing for the elastic. We're going to iron those seams nice and flat once again, and if you've done this correctly, this should be the right side of your fabric facing up, and if you're doing a print, it makes it very obvious that you've done it the right way because the print should be on the outside with the seams nice and flat like this. We're going to iron those seams that we've sewn nice and flat, and I like to make sure that they're pushed all to one side. It just helps make it look really professional and just sit nice and flat as well. This is what it should look like on the inside and the outside. It's very nice looking and it's very sturdy as well, so you don't have any threads hanging out anywhere. Now we're going to move on and do the hem. So we're going to flip the skirt back inside out and fold over that bottom edge by 1 centimeter or 1/2 centimeter depending on how big you want your hem to be and how long you want the skirt to be, but I've done 1 centimeter, and then we're going to iron that. Now that it's nice and flat, we're going to fold it over once again, and you can iron this down and pin it in place, and then you're basically just going to do this all along the edge until you have your hem sitting nice and flat. Again, this is just a way that you can do it without an overlocker, and it'll just encase all of those raw edges so that they're sitting on the inside and they won't come loose or come apart or anything. So just continue to do this method along the whole hem until it's finished, and then we can move on and do the waistband. With the waistband, we're going to do the exact same thing, so folding over 1 centimeter, and then we're going to fold that over again after we've ironed it, and then we can pin it in place and iron it again. Now, you want to make sure that you're leaving enough room when you're sewing to fit your elastic in the casing. So the elastic that we're using is a 9mm elastic, and this is going to go through the casing here. So I like to measure it out and make sure that I'm leaving enough space for my elastic to go through. You can shimmy it up and add or take depending on what you want. If you want to use a thicker elastic as well, just make sure that you add more fabric when you're cutting out to be able to add a thicker elastic into there. Once that's all done, we're going to go to the sewing machine, and I like to take off that sort of arm part that has all of our like extra bits for the sewing machine. I like to take that off, and then I kind of put the skirt through, or the bottom part of the skirt through the sewing machine, and then I can have that top part that I'm sewing on the top, and it just kind of creates like a little circle, I guess, around the sewing machine. We're going to sew our hem now, and again we're just going to do a 1 centimeter seam allowance and sew nice and close to that folded edge to keep it nice and flat and make sure that it stays down and it doesn't like flick up or anything like that. If you don't want to do this method for the hem, you can just do it with an overlocker and overlock the raw edge or zigzag stitch the raw edge and then fold it over 1 centimeter, iron it down, pin it in place, and then you can sew it, and that does the exact same thing as well. This is just a really nice way to hide all of your edges, and I think it just makes it look really, really professional as well. Okay, my bobbin runs out when I'm filming this, so just ignore how this looks here. But basically, you get to the end, just overlap it a little bit, do a back tack, and make sure that it's all nice and secure. And then we can move on to the waistband. Again, this is the exact same method that we did just before. We're going to sew a 1 centimeter seam allowance really close to that edge that we've got there with our folded fabric, and you want to make sure that you're leaving enough space so that your elastic can thread through. Because we're using that 9mm elastic, you want to make sure that it is 1 centimeter or just over 1 centimeter seam allowance so that the elastic can go through and it's not going to get all tangled, or it's not going to be too hard to go through the casing. Keep sewing, and once you get close to the end, or like where you've started, you're actually going to leave about 1 inch or 2 inch gap just so that we can thread the elastic back through. So as you can see, I back tacked at the beginning, back tacked at the end, and left about a 2 to 3 centimeter gap there, or a 1 inch gap just there so that we can thread our elastic through. There's measurements for the elastic in the PDF printout, but if you don't want to use those measurements, you can measure your waist and then minus about 3 centimeters off of that, or 1 inch off of that. And then all you have to do is thread your elastic through that little hole that we left when we were sewing, and you just have to shimmy it through all the way around. Make sure that when you're going, your elastic isn't flipping over or anything like that, because then it will cause it to be all tangled up on the inside of the casing. Once you get to the end, just take out that safety pin and make sure that your elastic is sitting nice and flat. And what we're going to do is lay your elastic on top of each other, and then we're going to zigzag stitch over this. And I zigzag stitch because it does the exact same thing as if you were working with knitted fabric. I know a lot of people kind of do like a little straight stitch with a square method. That's really hard to do on this small piece of elastic. So the easiest way to do it is by going back and forth with a zigzag stitch and making sure that it's nice and secure. I go up and down like 3 or 4 times, just back and forth. And then as you can see, it's nice and stretchy, and because it's a zigzag stitch, it allows the elastic to move and you still get that stretch with it. Shimmy your fabric around just so that the elastic will sit inside the casing and it's nice and flat. And then we're going to go find that opening, and we're going to sew a straight stitch to close over that opening, and then you're basically done.
And once you're done, you should have your gorgeous Cora Maxi skirt. It's super, super gorgeous and just perfect for an everyday sort of outfit. You can also wear it on nights out, and it's just super, super gorgeous. If you did it with the French seam method, as you can see, you should have your inside seams looking like this. Make sure that you iron them all to the same side as well so that they all just sit nice and flat and everything. But that's the inside, very nice. And then we've also got the hem, all of that raw edge is hidden underneath, and it looks like this on the outside. And then of course our waistband. I probably should have done my waistband a little bit tighter, but that's okay. When you're wearing this, you don't really notice much of the elastic at all anyway. Anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed this tutorial, and I can't wait to see you guys make your very own Cora bias cut maxi skirt. So please be sure to tag me at inmay_the_label on Instagram or TikTok with your creations. I really love to see it, and I'm so excited to see you create your very own Cora skirt. Bonus points if you also do the Cora vest and you make it as a set, because that's just perfect. Thanks for watching. Bye!